What is up, everybody? I apologize if there was a delay in making this review. There were some things that were going on that I had to sort out, and I was busy with a few other things outside of the channel. However, I'm back and I'm ready to start the first of 3 lesser-known television releases on DVD. The first one we're starting off with is Antarctic Antics. So let's take a look at the release history of this ugly duckling. Antarctic Antics was first released on VHS and DVD on November 30th, 2004 by Hit Entertainment. Ironically, while this DVD is a bit curious, it's yet another one that that never got a lot of recognition. But what confuses me is that this is the front cover of the DVD, but it's very different to the VHS. I don't understand that. And I generally question the decisions they made for the covers of the tape and the DVD. I mean, why make them totally different? Guess we'll never know. And not to mention, this DVD also got a 2006 release, and a way you can tell them apart and differentiate 2004 to 06 is that the 06 version has the 20th Century Fox logo on it. But after this, it just disappeared. Now, that concludes the history of this release. Now let's go on to our episodes. So Antarctic Antics contains 10 episodes from the first 3 seasons of the series. Pingu Runs Away, Pingu at the Doctor, Pingu's Long Journey, Pingu's Admirer, Pingu at the Fairground, Pingu Has Music Lessons, Pingu and His Friends Play Too Loudly, Pingu Dreams, Pingu's Curling Party, and Pingu's Birthday. Just a quick note before we start. Since I don't know much about Pingu, I'm just going to skip to my opinions on each episode, and I'll rate them the same. And if you want more information on these episodes, you can look at them on the Pingu Wiki. So, with that said, our first of the 10 episodes is Pingu Runs Away, or Pingu Runs Away from Home. So, let's start the antics. When I was going through the episodes for this review, the one I dreaded going through was Pingu Runs Away. Let me just make this clear. This is my least favorite episode of the franchise. And while I mostly prefer the newer version of the series, I can't ignore how terrible this episode is. I mean, who the literal would recommend make this episode? And how many people talk about it? It's that forgettable. And this story makes me hate Pingu's parents a lot. And if I originally rated this episode a 3 out of 10 on a comment-filled video, but now I think this episode is a prom night dumpster fire to be featured on the release, and I enormously hate it. So in conclusion, I'd say this episode is not worth my time. I rate this one on the DVD. The episode itself remains as a 3 out of 10, but for this DVD, I rank it a 1 out of 10. Ah, yes, Pingu at the Doctor. While not being the best episode to continue off from a otherwise terrible one, it is a pretty good episode at best. Now, I don't know, I think this episode needs a tiny bit more recognition, Because what makes this unique in a sense is that it pretty much reminds me of the whole all fear of something. Kind of reminds me of a future television show episode, Abby's Afraid, which I will admit is good, one of the favorites. And even though it is one of the episodes from the release that is more character focused and driven, and while it doesn't help Pingu in the long run, I think it's a pretty decent enough episode and gets a solid enough rating for me. I rate this episode a 6.5 out of 10. I'm not sure how many people feel about this episode, but me personally, I think this one is quite unique in a sense. While this episode is focused on Pingu and Pingy, I'd say this episode has a good moral of us wishing to see the world, but sometimes you need to remember, sometimes it's best to stay where you are. It definitely reminds me of the freaking awesome episode, All at Sea, which we'll cover another time. And while I'm on the topic of that, it reminds me of the quote from the episode, sometimes the best travels are those we can only dream about. So while this episode may not be perfect in the long run, I think it's a pretty good release that gets my 2 cents. 7 out of 10. I think this episode is a pretty good one. We're introduced to a new character, Pingy, who is definitely a favorite character, and I'm glad she's introduced with a sole reason and to be there. And the fact that and I really wish they would have done more with Pingu and Pingy, because they're just paired together for a few seconds in some episodes, but then just disappear. If I had it my way, I would make... But other than that, I think this is a great introductory story for a new character, and it's probably one of my favorites on this release. 10 out of 10. This episode is basically not a favorite to me, but it's still above the stuck in the middle grade. To me, I like this episode basically because it's based around a very good concept. And ironic and even and I feel like the visuals and the mechanics of some parts of sections of the episode are pretty good. And what makes this unique in a sense is what sort of saves this episode from being a stuck in the middle is ironically the ending. When's the next time we're gonna see such a good moment like that? But in conclusion, I'd say that this one is a very good, decent one, which definitely gets my respect. And it lands itself in the middle of 5 and 6 to get a 5.5 out of 10. This episode, ironically, is known for having a long title, and it's practically a learn from the best episode, which isn't a bad concept which is definitely a bad concept if it's done wrong, but holy crap, this episode is sort of relatable in a sense. And even though it may be a lesser known one on the release, I still think it's pretty well written. And it kind of earns my respect a little bit. I rate this a 6 out of 10. This episode is basically a weak one. I know some because two of the characters are jerks in this episode, and jerk characters don't really fly with me. But I do like how Pingu gets one of their characters, gives one of the characters their comeuppance during part of the episode. That's hilarious. And even though it doesn't further characters in the long run, I really think this is a decent episode that I have a heavy guilty pleasure with, even though it's one of the messier episodes on the release. 4.5 out of 10. Holy shit! Where do I start with this terrifying one? For starters, I'm not really keen on this episode, and this is going back as far as when I first watched it. And the main reason why is obviously the walrus in this episode. Terrifying imagery in the book illustrations aside, I think this episode is basically a nightmare fuel death trap, even for those who like the show to enormous levels. And I don't really see the appeal in this episode, because it's terrifying because of the walrus, yes, but I'm also one of those many few people who think this is terrifying, but I'm one of these few people who place it above Pingu Runs Away in terms of episode ratings. And it's not like this walrus plays a major role in the story. He's only here for a little bit, only to terrify people, and it's better fitted on a hit era DVD release themed to Halloween. And obviously, I'm just gonna finish this review off by saying this episode is creepy, the walrus, ugh, and this is a very episode to put on this release. If I were to rate this episode in general, I would have rated it a 1 out of 10, but in terms of this release, I'm gonna rate it a 2 out of 10. Only because it's my second least favorite story matching up to Pingu Runs Away. And other than that, this episode is a dumpster fire and I don't care about it, and everyone agrees with me about its hatred. So let's move on. Whew! A good breath of fresh air from a somewhat terrible episode. This one is interesting, to say the least, with positives and negatives. I do think this episode was a good pick for the release, but my opinions on it are different from how I viewed it as a younger version of myself. I think this episode is good, but it's not 10 out of 10 perfection good. I will admit, the idea of curling, I will admit real quick, I did not know what curling was back then. It was just one of those things sports that I didn't know at the time existed, because I didn't know better back then. But what makes this episode unique in a sense is the concept that they were going for, which isn't a bad one, but I'm just not too crazy about this, despite the recognition I'm giving it. I wouldn't go so far to say this is a favorite, but I can get by with it just fine. 9 out of 10. Ah, yes, Pingu's birthday. What an episode to end off a mediocre release. It's not while not being the best birthday episode, I think it's far from being a lesser known one. To me, what makes it special in a sense, in a somewhat ironic way, is the cue of happy birthday at the end that the team somehow managed to pull together. I really like this touch because it prevents them from using the other version, which I dare not explain at the moment. And while it may be and I think it's the second best episode on this release to match Pingu's Admirer. And while some people wouldn't consider this a personal favorite, I would definitely give it all of my recognition and more belonging in the Hall of Fame of episodes, as it is so amazingly awesome. Truly a remarkable episode to end off a somewhat mediocre release from the franchise. And I'm not gonna regret rating it, so I'm gonna give it a 10 out of 10. So what are my final thoughts on Antarctic Antics? After analyzing this release, do I think it lives up to its name and do I think it's worth purchasing? I would say, in my opinion, it does and it isn't. Because it has some very good episode choices on here, but but it's also really, really bizarre. 2 of the episodes on here are awful, and I could do without those bests. But the other episodes, well, I do think they are good, but given my ratings, I only think 3 of them are amazing, while the other ones fall a little flat. It's hard to say that they knew what they were doing when they were putting this release together. But even though that is the case, I still think it's very unique in a sense. But had they replaced the 2 dumpster fire episodes with 2 other perfect ones, this would have been an amazing release. I'm about 50-50 with this one. For those of you who are looking for a DVD from this franchise and are nostalgia-holics for this, then I would recommend getting it. But just as long as you skip Runs Away and Dream. But for those of you who are not fans of this franchise, I wouldn't waste your time. And that does it for this review. I'd like to say thanks to all you viewers for watching and check out my playlist of my other reviews that is in the description. So what is my next review going to be? Well, it's time I think I'm going to cover the second of 3 releases before I get to the final Snowy DVD for a little bit. So, I think it's time to see where it all began, down in Fraggle Rock. See you guys next time.